Hello boys and girls, so today we're back for story time again, and today we're reading Mr. Nosey, and I didn't know we were reading Mr. Nosey. It's my favourite one of the Mr. Men series, so I'm delighted. It's number 4. Mr. Nosey. Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. There he is, looking through the keyhole. I love this story. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. You're not supposed to open other people's letters. Mr. Nosey put that back. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all, but did that stop Mr. Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. Look at him, peeking through the windows again. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddletown. The people of Tiddletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too noisy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him. There's his house. It's different than the other houses we saw. The other houses were bungalows. They had no stairs, and this house is a 2-story house. It does have stairs. We must find some way of stopping him being so nosy, said old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. There's Mr. Chips. What does a carpenter do you know? A carpenter makes things out of wood. Bookshelves, tables, chairs, lots of different things. That's right, says Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tiddletown laundry. He needs to be taught a lesson. I wonder what the carpenter and Mrs. Washer are going to do. If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything, said Mr. Brush the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. Listen, he said, now grinning. I have a plan. All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. There's Mr. Brush, and he has a plan to stop Mr. Nosey poking into other people's business. I wonder what his plan is. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along Tiddletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peeped in. Splash went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. Oh dear, I am sorry, said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. Snap went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh dear, I am sorry, said Miss Washer, who was hanging up clothes on the washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street, feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Miss Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. That's very sore. That happened to me before. Very sore indeed. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself. And creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, he peeped around. There he is. I wonder if something will happen to him. Bang went a hammer right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh dear, I am sorry, said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor, red, sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. That's the third thing that's happened to poor Mr. Nosey. I don't think he's going to be nosy anymore. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and he crept up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did something, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. He kept walking, he didn't look. He's learning. Well done, Mr. Nosey. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tiddletown to tell everyone. He's so happy. That's great, Mr. Nosey isn't being nosy. The plan really had worked, because after that Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if you are ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you'd better expect one thing. A sore nose. That's the end of our story today, boys and girls. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm enjoying reading stories to you, and I hope you're all having a lovely time at home. I miss you loads. We won't be back in school for another while, but when we're back, we'll have loads of fun and play lots of new games, and we'll set up our new sandpit. See you soon.